The massive crystal halls of the Vellani High Council buzzed with panic as emergency alarms echoed through the chamber. Council leader Vexra stood before the enormous holographic display, her 4 arms trembling as she watched another red dot disappear from the galactic map. That was Kefnine, home to 12 billion Vellani citizens. Gone in less than 6 hours. "How many does that make?" asked Subcommander Neltok, his usually calm voice cracking with fear. 17 worlds in the past month, Vexra replied, her tentacles coiling around her ceremonial staff. "The Kroivak swarm moves faster than our evacuation fleets. They're not just conquering planets anymore, they're eating them." The hologram zoomed in on the latest battle reports from the frontier. Vellani defense ships, some of the most advanced vessels in the galaxy, floated as empty hulks in space. Their energy shields had been drained completely. Their quantum cannons had barely scratched the Kroivak, bioships that looked more like massive insects than spacecraft. War-Marshal Fexstar slammed his fist against the council table, making several smaller council members jump. "Our ancestors built these weapons to defend against pirates and raiders, not against this nightmare. The Kroivak don't follow any rules of war. They don't negotiate. They don't even communicate. They just consume everything organic they find." In the corner of the chamber, ancient archivist Colmy had been quietly accessing the forbidden data vaults. Her tentacles moved rapidly across the crystal interfaces as she pulled up files that hadn't been opened in over 1,000 years. The other council members noticed the change in lighting as the restricted archives came online. "Colmy, what are you doing?" Vexra asked sharply. "Those archives are sealed for good reason." The old archivist's voice was barely a whisper, but in the silent chamber, everyone heard her clearly. "We must break the ancient taboo. The Deathworlders, from the Sol system. The humans." The council chamber fell completely silent. Even the emergency alarms seemed to quiet down as if the building itself was holding its breath. For over 3,000 years, they had maintained a strict quarantine around that cursed yellow star system. Every child in Vellani space grew up hearing the terrifying stories about the monsters who lived there. Humans were the stuff of nightmares in their culture. Bipedal predators who had somehow evolved intelligence while keeping all their killer instincts. Their home world was a Class 12 death planet, where even the plants could kill you. The atmospheric pressure alone would crush most galactic species, and the gravity was nearly twice what most civilized beings could survive. "You're talking about inviting demons into our home," Neltok said, his voice shaking. "Those creatures are more dangerous than the Kroivak could ever be." But Vexra stared at the holographic display, showing their shrinking territory, and made the hardest decision of her long life. Archivist Colmez's ancient fingers moved across the crystal interface as she opened files that had been sealed since before most council members were born. The holographic display flickered and changed, showing grainy images and data fragments that made the entire council chamber grow cold with fear. "These records come from our first contact teams, over 3,000 years ago," Colmy began, her voice heavy with the weight of forbidden knowledge. "Back when we still sent exploration vessels to unknown systems. The team that discovered Sol 3 barely escaped with their lives." The first image appeared above the council table, a blue and green world that looked deceptively peaceful from orbit. But the data readings made several council members gasp in horror. Surface gravity nearly twice the galactic standard. Atmospheric pressure that would crush most species. Oceans filled with salt that would poison any civilized being. "They call their world Earth," Colmy continued. "The survey team detected massive predators in every environment. In the oceans, creatures larger than our biggest starships hunt in packs. On land, massive beasts with teeth like vibroblades compete for territory. Even their plant life is aggressive, with some species that can strangle a full-grown Vellani in minutes." War Marshal Fexstar leaned forward, studying the biological data. "Impossible. How could any intelligent species evolve in such conditions? The next series of images showed early recordings of humans themselves, bipedal creatures with forward-facing eyes, the universal mark of a predator species. Their mouths contained sharp white teeth designed for tearing flesh. Even their small offspring showed aggressive behavior that would be considered psychotic in civilized society. The exploration team observed them for several months before making contact. Colmy explained. They witnessed something that changed our understanding of what intelligence could look like. These humans were pack hunters, but they had learned to use tools. They worked together to bring down prey many times their size. The recordings showed groups of humans coordinating attacks with primitive weapons. They used fire as a tool, something that would terrify most galactic species. They consumed the flesh of other creatures, including some that appeared to have basic intelligence. Sub-Commander Neltok covered his eyes. They're cannibals. They eat their own kind. Worse than that, Colmy replied grimly. They eat everything. The survey team recorded them consuming hundreds of different species, plants, animals, even creatures from their oceans. They seem to have no natural food source because they treat everything as food. The final image showed what had convinced the ancient Galactic Council to quarantine the Sol system forever. Humans engaged in organized combat against their own species, not for territory or resources, but apparently for entertainment. They had turned warfare into sport. They fight for pleasure, Colmy whispered. Our ancestors determined that any species capable of such behavior was too dangerous to contact. They built weapons that could destroy entire worlds, then pointed them at each other. Council leader Vexra stared at the data, her heart racing. These creatures were everything nightmares were made of. But as she looked at the tactical displays showing the Krovac advance, she realized they might be exactly what the galaxy needed. Captain Lee Hyun was finishing his morning coffee when the impossible happened. The communication array on his patrol ship Vengeance lit up like a Christmas tree, receiving a signal on frequencies that had been silent for as long as anyone could remember. His hands shook slightly as he set down his mug and stared at the incoming transmission indicator. Captain, called Communications Officer Park Sol from her station, her voice filled with excitement and disbelief. You need to see this. We're receiving a structured signal from outside the Sol system. It's not random space noise. Someone is trying to talk to us. Heian had been patrolling the outer edge of human space for 12 years, and in all that time, they had never found so much as a hint that intelligent life existed beyond Earth. Humanity had spread to dozens of worlds, built massive space stations, and sent exploration vessels to distant stars, but they had always been alone in the universe. Can you decode it? Heian asked, moving to stand behind Sol's chair as she worked frantically at her console. It's actually not that difficult, Sol replied, her fingers flying across the holographic interface. They're using basic mathematical concepts as a foundation, then building up to more complex ideas. Whoever sent this is really smart, and they want us to understand them. The main view screen flickered to life, showing a creature that made Heian take a step backward. The being had 4 arms, skin that looked like purple leather, and tentacles where a human would have hair. But what struck him most was the expression in its large, dark eyes. It was absolutely terrified. Greetings, humans of the Sol system, the creature began, its voice shaking through the translation software. I am Ambassador the Shviani Council. We come to you in our darkest hour, seeking help from the greatest warriors the galaxy has ever known. Hyun looked around the bridge at his crew of 23 humans, all of them looking as confused as he felt. Greatest warriors, he muttered under his breath. We're just a patrol ship. The alien continued its transmission, and Heian could see that its hands were literally trembling. We know what your species is capable of. We know about your homeworld and the terrible conditions that forged you into the ultimate predators. We know about your wars and your weapons and your hunger for battle. What is this thing talking about? whispered Tactical Officer Kim Dong-woo from his station. "We haven't fought a real war in over 200 years. Ambassador Thekvei seemed to gather courage from somewhere deep inside, and continued speaking. "Our people are facing extinction at the hands of the Krovak swarm. They consume entire worlds, leaving nothing but empty space behind them. Our weapons cannot stop them. Our shields cannot protect us. But you, the Deathworlders from the Forbidden System, you might be our only hope." The transmission paused, and Nekvai seemed to be waiting for a response. Hyun realized that not only was this humanity's first contact with alien life, but these aliens already knew about humans, and were clearly terrified of them for reasons he couldn't begin to understand. "Show us this threat," Hyun replied calmly, trying to project confidence despite his confusion. He had no idea why these aliens thought humans were dangerous, but if they needed help, he was willing to listen. Fleet Admiral Kim Woo stood in the command center of Earth's primary orbital station, staring at the holographic display that showed the horror the Volani had been facing. The data package they had received painted a picture so disturbing that several of his senior officers had needed to step outside for fresh air. "My God," whispered Lieutenant Commander Jung Hana, her face pale as she reviewed the planetary survey reports. "Look at what used to be Volani Prime's agricultural moon. It had a population of 800 million. Now it's just ... empty rock." The before and after images were devastating. What had once been a green, thriving world, covered in vast cities and farmland, was now nothing more than a gray, lifeless sphere floating in space. Not even the oceans remained. The Krovak had literally consumed everything organic down to the molecular level. Admiral Kim Woo had been in the Terran Defense Force for 38 years. He had seen pirate strip mining operations that left worlds scarred and polluted. He had dealt with corporate raiders who clear-cut entire forests without replanting. But this was something completely different and infinitely worse. "There, not even trying to be efficient about it," he muttered, scrolling through the tactical analysis. "Look at these consumption patterns. They're destroying perfectly good agricultural equipment just to get at the organic lubricants. They're melting down entire cities when they could harvest the biological waste systems and leave the infrastructure intact." The recordings from Volani survivors showed the Krovak bioships in action. Massive, insect-like vessels that looked more grown than built. They would descend on a world like a plague of locusts, releasing billions of smaller creatures that swarmed across the surface. Everything living was consumed, digested, and converted into more Krovak drones. "It's like watching someone burn down a library to roast marshmallows," said strategic analyst Lee Minho, shaking his head in disgust. These worlds had ecosystems that took millions of years to develop, unique species that will never exist again. And for what? To feed this mindless hive that doesn't even appreciate what it's destroying. What made it even more frustrating was that the Krovak seemed to have no long-term planning whatsoever. They would strip a world completely bare, then move on to the next target, without ever attempting to establish sustainable harvesting operations. They were like a cancer that consumed everything in its path, without any thought for the future. "Admiral." Kim Woo closed the tactical files and turned to his assembled staff. "Gentlemen and ladies, this isn't warfare. This is pest control on a galactic scale. These Krovak are nothing more than an infestation that's gotten out of hand." He activated the fleet-wide communication system, knowing that his next words would change everything. "All ships, this is Admiral Kim Woo. We have our first contact with alien life, and they need our help. Prepare for immediate mobilization. We're going to show this swarm what happens when they threaten innocent people." Within 6 hours, the largest military fleet in human history was preparing to leave. Sol System for the very first time, the space around Kefsaven erupted in brilliance, flashes of light, as the human fleet dropped out of hyperspace. Aboard the Volani observation vessel Peaceful Dawn, Council observer Melkax watched in terror as dozens of human warships materialized in perfect formation. These were the legendary Deathworld vessels, bristling with weapons that could crack planets by the ancestors, whispered his aide Gelcor. Look at the size of those ships. The humans must be planning to glass the entire planet to stop the Krovak. But something unexpected happened. Instead of immediately opening fire on everything in sight, the human fleet began transmitting on emergency frequencies, not threats or demands for surrender, but evacuation coordinates and safety protocols. Down on Kef 7's surface, Commander Cho Min studied his tactical display as his transport approached the landing zone. The situation was chaos. Korvac bio-warriors swarmed through the Volani capital city, while terrified civilians ran in every direction. The local defense forces had already retreated to the mountain strongholds, leaving millions of people trapped in the urban areas. Battalion Alpha, listen up, Cho Min announced over the comm system as their dropships descended through the atmosphere. Primary mission is civilian evacuation. Secondary mission is pest control. I want clean shots only. These people have been through enough without us adding to their problems. The Volani expected the humans to land like a storm of violence, destroying everything in their path to get at the Krovak. Instead, they watched in amazement as human marines established protective perimeters around evacuation zones and began systematically herding civilians toward safety. Sergeant Park Ji-woo crouched behind an overturned transport vehicle, providing cover fire as a group of Volani families ran toward the evacuation ships. The Korvac bio-warriors were unlike anything humans had ever fought before. They looked like giant insects crossed with military vehicles, with natural armor plating and weapons that fired corrosive biological projectiles. Contact front, shouted Corporal Lee Dobbin as 3 Korvac warriors rounded the corner of a collapsed building. Her plasma rifle lit up the street as she put precise shots into their center mass, dropping all 3 before they could threaten the fleeing civilians. What confused the Krovak hive mind most was that these humans fought with an intelligence they had never encountered. Instead of running in terror or dying in place like every other species they had consumed, the humans coordinated their attacks with deadly precision. Squad 2, flank left and draw their fire, Commander Cho Min ordered through his comm system. Squad 3, move the families through the breach. Squad 4, cover our 6 and watch 4 ambush positions. The Korvac had evolved to fight prey animals that panicked when attacked. Their tactics relied on fear and overwhelming numbers to break enemy resistance, but humans had evolved as pack hunters, and they treated the Korvac exactly like what they were: dangerous animals that needed to be put down efficiently. Protect the evacuees, Cho Min shouted as his marines formed a defensive line around another group of fleeing Volani families. The humans were outnumbered 10-1, but they fought like they had already won. The battle for the Volani evacuation center was reaching its peak when Sergeant Kim Dossum spotted something that made her heart stop. A group of Krovak bio-warriors had broken through the defensive line and were advancing on a small shelter where dozens of Volani children huddled in terror. The younglings couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old in human terms, their large eyes wide with fear as the insectoid monsters approached. Without hesitation, Dosem sprinted across the open courtyard, her heavy combat armor clanking with each step. Plasma bolts sizzled past her head as the Krovak warriors fired their biological weapons, but she didn't slow down. She had a job to do, and nothing was going to stop her from doing it. Get away from them, she roared, placing herself directly between the advancing Krovak and the frightened children. Her assault rifle barked continuously as she poured concentrated fire into the lead bio-warrior, watching its chitinous armor crack and split under the sustained attack. The second Krovak warrior managed to get close enough to rake its razor-sharp claws across her chest armor, leaving deep gouges in the reinforced plating. A third warrior flanked her from the left, its mandibles clicking as it prepared to strike. Dosam knew she was outnumbered and outgunned, but she planted her feet and kept fighting. Dosam is in trouble, shouted Private Yoon Taeyun from across the courtyard. Immediately, half a dozen human Marines abandoned their own positions and rushed to help their squad mate. They didn't need orders. They didn't need to think about it. One of their pack was in danger, and that was all that mattered. Captain O. Junho arrived with the reinforcements, his heavy plasma cannon tearing through the Korvac warriors like they were made of paper. But he wasn't focused on the enemy he had just destroyed. His attention was entirely on Dasam, who had taken a serious wound to her shoulder, but was still standing protectively in front of the Villani. Children Villani. Observer Kelton watched this scene unfold from his position near the command post, his mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. According to every piece of data in the Galactic archives, humans were supposed to be selfish predators who cared only about their own survival. But this human female had just risked her life to protect children of a completely different species. I don't understand, Kelton said to Captain Oh Junho, as medics treated Dasam's wounds. Your soldiers fight harder when others are in danger. Every tactical manual in the galaxy says that intelligent species become more cautious when facing superior numbers, but your people do the opposite. Captain Oh Junho looked at the Villani observer with genuine confusion, as if the answer should be obvious. This is what we are, he explained simply. We evolved as pack hunters, but somewhere along the way, we learned that the pack could include anyone who needed protection. You're part of our pack now. Kelton stared at the human captain, finally beginning to understand the terrible mistake the galaxy had made. Humans weren't monsters at all. They were apex predators who had somehow developed a moral code that made them infinitely more dangerous to actual threats than any mindless killing machine could ever be. The alarm klaxons screamed through the human assault ship Iron Will as Commander Yang Sujin watched the tactical display with growing horror. A massive Krovac biocruiser had broken through their defensive line and was now bearing down on the Villani. Nursery ship Gentle Current. The alien vessel carried over 50,000 children and their caretakers, fleeing from their destroyed homeworld. That thing is 3 times our size, said Lieutenant Park Min-jae, his voice tight with tension as he studied the enemy vessel. It's got organic armor plating, 2 meters thick, and weapons that can melt through our hull like butter. Sujin watched the Krovac cruiser extend massive feeding tentacles toward the defenseless nursery ship. In less than 10 minutes, every living being aboard that vessel would be consumed and converted into more bio-warriors for the swarm. She had seen the aftermath of Korvac feeding operations before, and the images still haunted her dreams. Prep the boarding pods, she ordered, strapping on her combat gear. We're going in. Her assault team stared at her in shock. Boarding a Korvac vessel was considered suicide by every military manual in human space. The bioships were filled with warrior drones, defensive organisms, and toxic atmospheric conditions that could kill an unprotected human in seconds. Ma'am, with respect, that's a death sentence, said Sergeant Kim Hojin. We don't even know the internal layout of that thing. It could be a maze designed to trap intruders. Sujin finished checking her weapon and looked at her team of 12 volunteers. Those are kids over there. 50,000 children who are about to die if we don't do something. I don't care if it's suicide. I'm going. The boarding pods launched from the Iron Will like bullets, carrying the human assault team across the void between the 2 ships. The Krovac biocruiser's surface was covered in what looked like living tissue, pulsing with veins and arteries that carried nutrients throughout the vessel. It was like boarding a giant space monster rather than a traditional starship. The pods punched through the organic hull with a sickening squelch, and immediately the assault team found themselves fighting for their lives. The interior of the Korvac ship was a nightmare of tunnels and chambers that seemed to shift and change as they moved through them. Bio-warriors dropped from the ceiling and emerged from the walls, their chitinous claws dripping with corrosive acid. Stay together, Sujin shouted over the sound of plasma fire and alien screeching. Find the weapons array and shut it down. The fighting was brutal and desperate. For every Korvac warrior they killed, 2 more seemed to take its place. The team fought their way through corridors that looked more like intestines than hallways, their boots splashing through pools of biological fluid that made the air thick and hard to breathe. Halfway to their objective, they found something unexpected. A Villani navigator named Kolresh, barely alive after being partially consumed by the ship's digestive systems. Sujin didn't hesitate. She slung the wounded alien over her shoulder and kept moving, even though the extra weight made her an easier target for the pursuing bio-warriors. "No one gets left behind," she shouted to her team. The bridge of the flagship Terrace Pride shook violently as another wave of Korvac bio-projectiles slammed into their defensive shields. Admiral Kim Woo gripped the command rail, watching his tactical display as the true scope of the enemy force became clear. What they had been fighting was just the outer edge of the swarm. Now rising from the center of the Korvac formation, like a nightmare made real, came the Queen ship. The massive bio-vessel was larger than anything humans had ever built. It stretched nearly 20 kilometers from nose to tail, its living hull pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that seemed to hypnotize anyone who looked at it too long. Thousands of smaller bioships surrounded it, like antibodies protecting a vital organ, and from its core came the psychic signals that coordinated the entire swarm. "Sir, that thing is reading as having a crew of over 2 million bio-warriors," reported Tactical Officer Lee Sang-ho, his voice barely steady. "Our entire fleet combined has maybe 30,000 personnel. We're outnumbered 60 to 1. Admiral Kim Woo studied the formation, his mind racing through tactical possibilities. Every simulation they had run showed the same result. A direct assault on the Queen ship would result in the complete destruction of the human fleet. But if they didn't stop that thing here and now, it would continue consuming worlds until it reached Earth itself. "Admiral," came a transmission from the Villani command ship Peaceful Resolve. "Fleet Commander Vexgol here. Our analysis shows that the Queen ship's psychic control has a limited range. If we can force it to retreat beyond the outer system, the smaller bioships will lose coordination and become vulnerable." Kim Woo shook his head. "That thing isn't going to retreat. It knows we're the only real threat it's faced in centuries. It's going to stay here and finish us off." The Queen ship began to glow with an ominous red light as it charged its primary weapon. Intelligence reports suggested that this biocannon could destroy an entire planet with a single shot. If it fired on the Villani homeworld, 20 billion civilians would die in seconds. "All ships, this is Admiral Kim Woo," he announced over the fleet communication system. "I'm not going to lie to you. What I'm about to order is suicide. That Queen ship has to be stopped, and we're the only ones who can do it. Final attack pattern. All ships, direct assault on the hive mind core." On the bridge of the destroyer Soul, Captain Park Minesio received the order with grim determination. Her ship was one of the smallest in the fleet, but it was also the fastest. She looked around at her crew of 43 men and women, all of them young enough to have families back on Earth. "You heard the Admiral," she announced over the ship's intercom. "We're going in. Anyone who wants to object can do it in the escape pods." Not a single person moved toward the escape pod bays. The Soul accelerated toward the Queen ship at maximum burn, followed by dozens of other human vessels. The Korvac bioships tried to intercept them, but the humans had learned something important during their battles. The hive mind had never faced opponents who would willingly sacrifice themselves for others, and it couldn't predict their movements. Captain Park Minesio's ship took hit after hit as it approached the Queen ship's primary weapon array, but she held course. At the last second, she spoke into her comm system, "For Earth, and for our new friends." The Soul rammed directly into the Queen ship's biocannon, her hull breaching as she gave everything to protect the innocent. The silence that followed the Queen ship's destruction was unlike anything the galaxy had ever experienced. For 3,000 years, the psychic screaming of the Korvac hive mind had been a constant background noise that most species had learned to ignore. Now suddenly, it was gone. The remaining bioships drifted aimlessly through space, their connection to their controlling intelligence severed forever. Captain Yoon Ji-hai stood on the observation deck of her heavily damaged cruiser, New Dawn, watching as the scattered Krovac vessels began to shut down, one by one, without the Queen Mind to coordinate their actions. The bio-warriors were nothing more than mindless drones that couldn't even feed themselves properly. "Final casualty reports are coming in," said her aide, Lieutenant Kim Subin, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "We lost 47 ships and over 8,000 personnel. But the Vellani estimates suggest we saved over 200 billion lives across 17 different worlds." The cost had been terrible. But as Ji-hai watched Vellani rescue ships moving among the human wreckage to save survivors, she knew they had done the right thing. For the first time in galactic history, two completely different species had fought, side by side and won against impossible odds. 3 weeks later, the Galactic Council chambers on Vellani Prime were packed with representatives from hundreds of different species. Most of them had never seen a human before, and Ji-hai could feel their curious stares as she walked to the central podium. Some seemed nervous, still influenced by the old stories about the terrifying Deathworlders. Others looked at her with something approaching AW. Council leader, Vexra rose from her ceremonial chair. Her forearms spread wide in the traditional Vellani gesture of welcome. "Captain Yoon-ji, High of the human species, you stand before the assembled representatives of 43 different civilizations. We have gathered to formally apologize for 3 millennia of unjust quarantine and to offer humanity full membership in the galactic community." The chamber erupted in a cacophony of alien voices, some cheering, others still expressing doubt about the wisdom of accepting the legendary Deathworlders into civilized society. Ji-hai waited for the noise to die down before responding, with, "Respect, Council Leader. We're not interested in just joining your community," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the translation systems. "We want to help protect it." Vexra's tentacles swayed with what Ji-hai had learned was the Vellani equivalent of surprise. "What do you mean?" "The Krovac weren't the only threat out there," Ji-hai explained. "Our deep space sensors have detected at least 6 other hostile forces moving through unexplored regions of the galaxy. Species that view peaceful civilizations as nothing more than resources to be consumed. You need protectors, and we need a purpose." She gestured to the holographic display that showed the proposed structure of the new human galactic defense force. "We're not asking to rule anyone. We're offering to stand guard so you can continue to build the peaceful society you've created." An elderly representative from the Altarian Federation stood up, his crystalline form shimmering with nervous energy. "But how do we know you won't turn on us, eventually? Your species is capable of incredible violence." Ji-hai smiled sadly. "Because we choose not to be violent. Every day, every human makes the choice to protect instead of destroy, to build instead of conquer. We never wanted to be feared. We only wanted to belong." The vote was unanimous. Humanity had finally found its place among the stars.